Mark chapter 1, 21 to 28. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue, who was possessed by an impure spirit, cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly all over the region of Galilee.
I don't know about you, but I often feel uncomfortable when I read stories in the Bible about people who are described as being possessed by evil spirits. You know, we understand so much more today about issues of mental health and how some of the things that might once have been described as demon possession can probably be explained now as some other disorder and therefore treated, and not something to be stigmatized or afraid of. And so we want to take the gospel narrative seriously, but we also want to avoid stigmatizing people who need our help and our support. But we also too need to recognize that there are spiritual dimensions of good and evil that we simply do not fully understand, and we do need to take seriously. So what are we to make of this story, of this encounter between Jesus and this clearly deeply troubled man in the synagogue? Well, we might be tempted to avoid the story altogether, but because it does present these kind of difficulties for us. But I think the place that we have to start is not so much to sit and try to analyse or to argue over what caused this particular man's condition, because we don't know. And we don't know what caused many of the ailments that Jesus came and brought relief and release and healing from. But what we do know is that the only way that this story would have made sense in the culture that it was written and for the people to whom it was written was to describe the man's condition in the way that it is. And I'm not sure that the gospel accounts were ever drafted so that 2,000 years later we could forensically analyse everybody's condition in the light of them, but rather to celebrate the impact and the effectiveness of Jesus' response. In short, this story is told so that we can better understand who Jesus is and how Jesus reacts. And as followers of Jesus, we do that and then recognize that we are invited to have the same attitude. But we might usefully just pause to consider what this man's condition did represent. Now, we might want to argue that although the culture at the time described him as possessed, he was simply suffering from a mental health condition. And even if we're wrong in that respect, we can be certain that his situation would have caused him a great deal of anguish and emotional pain because of what he was in the grip of. And that's particularly relevant for us at the moment because I sense that we are all emotionally scarred by what we've been through in recent months. For some of us, that will be particularly painful and raw because we've directly suffered or lost loved ones through this dreadful disease. Or perhaps our mental health was pretty fragile anyway, and the ongoing struggle of current events has just become too much for us. Or perhaps we are just wearied and worn down by living under the shadow of this for so long now. And this week, as we've already acknowledged in today's service here in the UK, the death toll has passed 100,000. And I sense that many of us were deeply troubled by the arrival of that statistic, even though I guess we could kind of see that it was coming. And as we look back at this story from the Gospels, acknowledging all of these realities that we bring to it, we can recognize that the man who cried out in the synagogue that morning, whatever the underlying cause of his condition, was a man who was in mental and emotional turmoil. And what we might pause to recognize, first of all, is simply this, that Jesus let him cry out. He didn't tell him to shut up. He didn't ask the people to take him outside. He didn't try to hide the man's condition away. Okay, it had some deeper meanings that we're going to explore in a few moments. But this is a story about reality being laid bare. The reality of who Jesus was, the reality of the struggle that Jesus came to engage. But it begins by a man being free to cry out and to lay bare his reality, the reality of his anguish and pain and struggle. You know, a couple of weeks ago, if you're a regular to these services and sermons, you may remember that we were looking together at the story of Samuel. And although the episode that we focused on was from a few years later, that story begins when a woman turns up at the shrine of Shiloh and just pours out her anguished heart. That's where that big story starts. So maybe as we travel deeper into this story, it might do us good to simply pause and to recognize that Jesus makes room for the cries of our heart. We don't need to hide our struggles away. Our worship is not intended to take our minds off all of that and all that's happening in the world at the moment. It's the place where we can remember and we can rediscover God at its very centre. And then there are those who would argue that we're intended to take this story as an act on the part of Jesus to symbolize a greater struggle. The man is presented to us as someone who is in the grip of evil. And there are many who would argue that this would have been true for pretty much everyone in the synagogue that morning. Okay, they may not have been possessed by an evil spirit. They may not have been crying out their anguished interruptions, but their nation and their communities were in the grip of an oppressive empire. The Empire of Rome, with its occupying armies and heavy taxes that left people trapped in poverty, and the grip of the various local fiefdoms that then emerged to serve the interests of those who kind of had learned how to play the system to their own advantage. And then as they looked for a faith to release them from all of this oppression, they were largely confronted by the religion of the scribes and the Pharisees that demanded of them even more rigorous observance of the religious law codes. So many people in that synagogue that morning were likely to have felt trapped and oppressed by the forces that had no right to inflict themselves upon those people. And again, we might feel a little bit like that ourselves at the moment. We perhaps feel trapped by the ongoing threat of this infection, or trapped by the economic impact of it all, or trapped in our homes and unable to get to our familiar places of escape and connection. And Jesus brings light and hope into that situation. And this perhaps takes us to a third dimension of this man's condition, which is to take it as read and to see the confrontation that emerges in the meeting room of the local synagogue as a battle between good and evil. The forces of darkness speak out, disturbed into revealing themselves by the presence of Jesus. But they declare themselves as defeated almost before the conversation has begun, because they ask the question, have you come to destroy us? But what we see is Jesus locked into a spiritual battle here. Now, as I said earlier, I don't think we need to forensically analyze every last detail of this man's condition, but rather to recognize through these different and overlapping dimensions a true reality for all of us. We live in a world which is marred and which is scarred and which is in the grip of forces that are not the forces that God would ultimately see prevailing. And we can't just neatly separate life out into that which is spiritual, and that which is physical, or that which is personal, and that which belongs in public life. These things constantly collide in our lives. When we're feeling physically unwell, it can still leave us mentally and emotionally drained, or we can be quite naturally overtaken by worry as we're concerned about the possible consequences or the treatment that we're going to have to require, or at the moment perhaps just a fear that the medical services might not have the capacity to help us if we do need them. Very seldomly are we physically infirmed and then not have mental pressure and mental health issues that come with that. And these big narratives, the economic uncertainty, the fear of infection, the monotony of lockdown, all take their toll on us as individuals. They are neither personal or public issues. They are both. And of course, we have been rightly reminded this week, and we have rightly stopped to remember that tragic statistic of 100,000 people in the UK alone. And I make no apology for repeating that, because it's not a statistic. It's the joining together of 100,000 individual tragedies. 100,000 families in mourning, 100,000 goodbyes that were never quite made properly because of the COVID situation. These big public issues are not just someone else's problem. They are simply the sum total of our individual struggles and challenges, our individual hopes and expectations. As I said, all of these things merge into one another. And so, I think that we can look at this encounter between this man and Jesus and at one level see something that is incredibly personal and intimate as Jesus reaches out to him in the midst of his condition. But at another level, to see them each as representing this vast array of struggles and human struggles and forces of oppression and the fullness and all the goodness and the virtues of God's kingdom almost locking horns with one another. And I think that we can therefore all place ourselves in that story. We may not be afflicted in exactly the same way that this man was afflicted. We may not even be able to distinguish whether our afflictions are spiritually or physical or psychological or economic or just normal. But I don't think it matters, because to me, the story says there is room for you here. Jesus has come to listen to your unique story, your unique experience of all the forces of oppression that confront us at the moment. And as we place ourselves in that synagogue, and as we, so to speak, become a virtual member of that congregation, I believe that there are three things that God might say to us through it. And the first is this, that actions and words belong together. Jesus is introduced to this congregation not as a miracle worker or as a great liberator. They didn't turn up expecting to see this public confrontation between the forces of good and evil. He was just a visiting preacher. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to preach. We're told in verse 21. And not only that, but from what we can gather, it was a pretty good sermon. So in verse 22, we read that the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Now, there's a sobering conclusion for those of us who are regular Sunday preachers. Now, this guy really knows what he's talking about, not like the people that usually turn up and we end up listening to. But what I want us to notice is this. What happens next, if you like, is the moment when Jesus is challenged to, how we might say today, put his money where his mouth is. I suspect that we all recognise that there are those in our world who can stand at the front and make some pretty convincing arguments and claims, or these days can go onto YouTube and make some pretty convincing arguments and claims. There are those who can manage to speak with authority, but they don't always manage to deliver. So often that'll be the question that we come away with. That all sounds great, but will they deliver? Can they really accomplish what they claim? And in many respects, this is what this impure spirit is described as challenging Jesus to do. Okay, you've spoken with authority. You've won over the audience in the room. but how far does your authority extend? Can you deal with us? And of course, the events that follow, and through those events, Jesus answers that question with a pretty emphatic yes. So at one level, God's response to us as we gather with our own burdens and our own struggles is to lift us out of our immediate circumstances and to remind us of who he is. Yes, our faith is to be lived out in the midst of everyday life. Our message has a relevance to the issues that we face there, and we are called to put our words into action. But we do so as servants of one whose authority extends beyond these things. And Jesus didn't just declare his authority with words, he demonstrated it with actions. And I think that says two very profound things to us. The first is simply that we can put our faith in God. We can sing as we sang at the beginning of our service, "Great is your faithfulness," even though life might be a struggle at the moment. Because Jesus hasn't just told us that this is true. He's demonstrated it. He's put his money where his mouth is, to quote the modern slogan. But I think it also, therefore, calls us to do the same, to think about how we live out the values and the messages of our faith, which of course will require us to do very different things at the moment to what we're used to. But Jesus on this occasion reminds us that words and action belong together. And the second thing I think that we can draw from this encounter is what we might describe as our prophetic calling. "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" is the cry of these forces of darkness. Now, however unfamiliar and uncertain we might feel about the circumstances that are outlined in this story, that refrain is a very, very familiar one in our society. I don't think that there are actually that many people in our world who are particularly negative towards our faith. But what we are often told is it's our faith, it's our personal business, and it's not something that should be making an impact beyond itself. I remember some years ago I was invited to a meeting with the local planning department of our local council, and to be fair, it was a very well-intentioned meeting designed to try and help us, and they were trying to explain to us how planning applications are considered so that churches could take all of these things into account if they did submit plans for a new building or a new development. And so the planning officer begins to talk to us about the sort of things that we have to keep in mind: the visual impact of the building, the environmental impact, issues of noise and access, and all the things that would need to be taken into consideration if you were putting up a new public building. But I always remember his final statement, because when he'd finished showing all his PowerPoint slides, he just looked at us and he said, "Look, in short, it's our job to make sure that if you do build a new church, it has as little impact as possible on the local neighbourhood." And I think I was one of a number of people in the room who just smiled at that point, because we all knew what he meant, but we also kind of wanted to say to him, you really don't understand the purpose and commission of the church if you think that our primary concern is going to be that we don't make an impact on our neighbourhood. But I sense that planning officer, well-intentioned as his words may have been, really voiced what many people feel about the message of Jesus today. By all means, believe it. By all means, preserve it. But don't let it get in the way of our lives. What have you got to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? And of course you could say, well, nothing. After all, Jesus and these impure spirits are presented as opposites. They are the light and the darkness, the good and the evil in this story. But Jesus had not come to hide away in the corner. He came as one with authority. So the answer to this question, what have you got to do with us, is everything. Because light dispels darkness. Everything, because I see a human being made in the image of God, loved by God, and I have come to be the saviour of this humanity. So I stand against anything and everything that holds humanity in the grip of its oppression. You know, I'm delighted when I hear of local churches being turned into vaccine centres or operating as food banks and community support hubs. I'm delighted when I hear stories of Christians who are working as key workers, or people like Rachel who joined us in our service last week, who are volunteering in their local communities. And in fact, I know that some churches have deliberately joined in these online gatherings so that you can release your own resources to serve your local communities. And I think that's great. And I don't think for a minute that that is a distraction from the gospel or even an add-on to it. It is the gospel. Because humanity is in the grip of oppression right now. The oppression of a deadly and highly contagious disease. And we've seen some of the shortcomings of our human systems and structures when we hear of governments in dispute with each other to make sure that they get hold of the vaccines first. And we've got to recognise too that many of the other issues of oppression, economic injustice, issues of climate justice, health and emotional well-being, racial inequality, and many more still remain in our world. And they all may choose to cry out, just as the voices of oppression cried out in the synagogue, "What have you got to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Stay in your pulpit, stick to your preaching." And Jesus responds emphatically in word and deed, "Everything. That's what I have to do with you. Come out and be seen for what you are and be gone." And if we are to call ourselves followers of Jesus, then these are the footsteps in which we are called to walk. And the third thing that I want us to recognise is that people take notice of what they see. What is this? A new teaching? And with authority, it says in verses 27 and 28. And the news of him spread across Galilee. And I think, again, the narrative speaks to us at two levels here. The first is the events themselves, and there is a very simple but important assertion here. When people see Jesus put in action behind his words, when people see Jesus taking on the forces of oppression and calling them out, they're impressed and they want to know more. And we continue to believe that we're not simply called to be a church for ourselves, but a church that offers a message of certainty and hope for our communities. And people are looking for authority. Not an authority that is kind of dictated, but an authority that's revealed through authenticity, an authority that is proved by turning words into action. And so we who long to see the Church of Jesus grow and flourish are encouraged to follow this example, because it is through examples like this that the world sees and believes. But I mentioned a few moments ago that the narrative speaks on two levels. And if you look at the text of Mark's Gospel in particular, you notice that questions like this appear a lot at the end of his miracle stories. It's almost as if he's using them as a bait to draw the reader into asking those same questions. And if you think about it, at the time when Mark's Gospel was written, nobody would have disputed the fact that Jesus lived. And they wouldn't have been that surprised at his story. I mean, after all, the Roman Empire was littered with the crucifixion sites and tales of well-meaning heroes who landed up there. But Mark wanted the world to know that this story was different. This wasn't just another story. This was the story of humanity's salvation. So yeah, look at who it is, he says to us. On this occasion, someone with authority. On other occasions, someone who forgives sins, or on another, one who can command the waves of the ocean. And these are all phrases that appear in books like Psalms as descriptions of God. Mark wants us to see more than a restored man and another battle between good and evil. He wants us to recognize God at the very heart of these human struggles. He wants us to see that this particular individual who was taken and crucified is no other than God himself. And that is our purpose. As we are inspired to follow the example of Jesus, we do so that God can be seen in us. Let your light shine, says Jesus on another occasion, so that people may see the good that you do and glorify not you, but your Father in heaven. You know, with our church buildings closed at the moment and our activities so curtailed, many of us may wonder, well, how do we connect? But let's remember that our calling in this pandemic and in every other situation is not so much to make the church visible as to make Jesus visible. So yeah, this is not the easiest of stories to read and to understand, but I do think it says some important things to us. Jesus lived out the truth with actions as well as words, and that can reassure us that we can believe in him, and it can inspire us to do the same. Jesus engaged with the forces of oppression, and in a world that might want to cry out, "What have you got to do with us, Jesus?" the answer remains the same: everything. And Jesus revealed more of his full self through the engagement that day. And our calling in today's world is to continue to make Jesus recognizable through the people that we are. So may God help us all to live out that calling.